Cuba conjures up vivid images. It's either the Castro's socialist paradise or a totalitarian nightmare, depending on your politics. But it's still doggedly holding out against American capitalism. So this was probably the most unlikely event I could have ended up at on my very first night in Cuba.
Es un evento en el que compiten los muchachos y el que gane va a representar Cuba.
It's a breakdancing competition come youth marketing event run by the multinational beverage giant Red Bull. It might seem like a cynical branding exercise, but somehow in Cuba it feels genuinely underground. Advertising is virtually non-existent here because it's banned by the government, and these kids aren't used to even modest corporate largesse. The music turns out to be unapologetically American. For decades after the revolution, anything from the US was viewed with suspicion or hostility. And while many older Cubans still feel that way, this crowd is not afraid of flying the flag for their former enemy. Tonight's just a tiny taste of the commercialisation that might soon engulf Cuba and change its unique way of life forever. But when I ask around, these young people aren't concerned.
Este tipo de actividades se lo merece Cuba. Y es así y vamos a mejorar porque Cuba es una isla buena donde nos merecemos el desarrollo ir adelante, una isla, la isla del encanto.
Cuba may be enchanted to some, but it's certainly not rich. Everyone here gets free healthcare and education, plus government subsidies for food, housing and transport. The trade-off is the majority of people work in government jobs that pay just $30 a month. Not much to spend. Part of the problem is the strict trade embargo imposed by America for the past 5 decades.
The Cuban government has used the embargo as a weapon, let's say, against the United States. You know, a little island, and, you know, there's this embargo that doesn't allow us. So everyone wants to see how we can move Cuba towards change. The thing is, you know, how much is it going to be possible?
Before the thaw was revealed, President Raúl Castro had already been taking baby steps towards capitalism.
For example, the only private enterprise that was allowed for any Cubans was to have a little small restaurant at home, right? In fact, they limited the restaurant to 12 chairs. They couldn't hire anyone that was from outside of the family. And now they're allowed a bigger size.
Until recently, ordinary Cubans couldn't own cars made after 1959. But now all cars can be freely traded by everyone. And there are also bigger projects, like a new harbour and free trade zone. But it's the prospect of America dropping its embargo that's triggered a gold rush of investors from Europe and China.
Countries have been coming and trying to fill the spaces before US actually opens the Cuban market. So it is the first visible outcome of these measures are not coming from the United States.
There are other openings too. Airbnb has started up and new charter flights. Internet access though is still expensive, slow and restricted to a tiny percentage of the population, which limits the influence of the outside world. But now that too may start to change, something ordinary people like musician Tamni are excited to see.
Lo que yo creo que va a pasar, pero sí, había una traba muy grande con eso y ahora creo que es una manera también de poder comercializar
there is a social structure that is changing with the creation of this sector of owners of small businesses or mid-sized businesses.
All these changes are not only seen as opportunities though. They're also making people anxious about losing Cuba's extensive social safety net.
Y que está ahora abriendo esa puerta sin tratar de lastimar todo lo que se ha ido tratando de conseguir hasta hoy con los principios de nuestro país, abrirnos a todos los cambios grandísimos que están viniendo. Pienso que necesitamos un poquito de tiempo.
Whether the flurry of change is going to lead to political freedoms is hard to know. Down on the famous Malecon seafront, I come across a sculpture exhibition. The government here is a big supporter of the arts, and a degree of free speech is increasingly tolerated, but only up to a point. Explicit criticisms of the regime can still land you in jail. But some artists still find ways to make a point, thanks to music. Music is everywhere in Cuba. More than any country I've ever visited. It's one of the nation's proudest exports. But its lyrics can also put provocative opinions out into the open. In his 73 years, Giovanni del Pino Rodriguez has seen a lot of changes. He's part of Cuba's old guard. He's even met Fidel Castro himself after a gig.
Y él vino y me llamó y me dijo, ven acá, tú no te vas a tirar una foto conmigo. Y yo, como no, comandante.
When I talk to Giovanni about the thaw with the US, he sounds hopeful at first. But it's tempered by memories of the wearying Cold War hostilities of the past.
Yo creo que es muy bueno para ambos pueblos, tanto para el cubano como para el norteamericano. Está imbuido de la política rastrera que se ha llevado por tanto tiempo y la propaganda sucia que se ha llevado por tanto tiempo.
Cuba's younger generation, however, are much more focused on the future. Rapper Barbaro El Urbano Vargas is constantly testing the limits of the law with his lyrics.
Pero por lo general, la gama de temas que se han tocado son temas sociales, historias personales que he vivido yo, historias que han vivido las personas de mi barrio, de mi alrededor, como la violencia doméstica, temas como la violencia doméstica, temas como el abuso policial, temas como el mismo racismo, temas como las inquietudes que siento yo hacia algunas decisiones que toma el gobierno.
Barbaro lives in this poor neighbourhood. He reckons there's a big generation gap here, with older people slow to acknowledge Cuba's domestic problems.
Nosotros más bien estamos dispuestos a combatir las cosas con las que no estamos de acuerdo, que la generación mía, desde un comienzo, desde que ya empieza a tomar uso de razón y conciencia, ya sabemos, empezamos a darnos cuenta de que hay de cosas que están mal, ¿entiendes? Y nuestros padres más bien ahora es que empiezan a darse cuenta de los cambios, pero de las cosas que están mal. Ya nos fuimos casi.
Barbaro's confrontational approach makes him a target for the authorities. And his neighbours are wary of my camera, something I come across many times in Cuba.
¿Cómo es? No, los muchachos no, estos muchachos no. ¿Qué lo hacen?
Barbaro plays up to their worst fears, that the neighbourhood Socialist committee will seek them out. They're laughing, but it's not clear how funny it is.
De ese lado estoy, del lado opuesto. Pero es muy complicado, realmente es muy complicado porque le bloquean todas las vías a uno, que se ponga por la televisión, que se promocione. No es un género que sea radiado, que se escuche por la radio.
Barbaro has performed with Cuba's most esteemed musicians and attracts a big audience, but he can't get a break on the national media. I'm curious how the system keeps Barbaro's music off the airwaves. Broadcasting here is all state-run, so I make a visit to the national radio station, Radio Havana. The station director, Magda Rezic, assures me that nothing so crude as censorship takes place here.
No, never happened. Our music institutions that have a specialist, and they advise us about the kinds of music that we have to play, but not, I don't remember now, censura.
Censorship.
It's not in a censorship way. It's in an advice way and giving us a very good Cuban music.
Despite that system, DVDs and thumb drives are making it hard for the regime to keep as much control over what Cubans see and hear as they once did. Back in the analogue days, a young man named Silvio Rodriguez rose to become a musical ambassador for the revolution.
Absurdo suponer que el paraíso es solo la igualdad, las buenas leyes.
Silvio is now known as the John Lennon of Latin America, a socialist icon who still sells out giant stadiums. He helped create a Cuban musical culture that tackles big ideas. But he could never have guessed the way that would come to divide his own family. In Tampa, Florida, Silvio's son, Silvito El Libre, is at work. He's a musician singing a very different song to his father.
Havana, cruel añoranza de los que están lejos, por no arrodillarse nunca frente a un régimen pendejo. Le pido.
Unfortunately, Silvito El Libre and his collaborators got caught up in the decades-long Cold War between Havana and Washington. This music festival Silvito took part in Cuba 4 years ago looks like an innocent party. Turns out it was being secretly funded by the US Agency for International Development in an attempt to foster grassroots opposition to the Cuban government. As these documents show, financial support they thought was coming from a Serbian media group was actually being funneled via a Panamanian shell company from the US government. And Silvito was tangled up in it.
Under Cuban law, to do something against the government while being paid by any foreign government is, of course, it is a crime against the national security.
Silvito says he knew nothing about the secret plan.
Como que quisieron desacreditarnos un poco, como siempre lo han querido hacer. De hecho, cuando en Cuba van a invertir otra gente de otros lugares, de otros países, nunca es algo tan sonado ni nada de eso, porque Cuba acepta dinero también de unos cuantos países y ahora mismo han formado una tormenta en un vaso de agua por una bobería que ellos saben que es una bobería.
Warmer relations between Washington and Havana might see an end to their long history of covert operations. But it'll be too late for Silvito. He's no longer allowed to perform anywhere in Cuba. But he can play elsewhere. When Presidents Raúl Castro and Barack Obama met face-to-face in Panama earlier this year, it was hailed as a major turning point.
Better relations between the United States and Cuba will create new opportunities for cooperation across our region.
the Cuban government brought out Silvio Rodriguez to perform for the big occasion.
Buenas noches, Panamá.
But meanwhile, across town, a hip-hop concert was underway featuring none other than Silvio's son, Silvito El Libre. It's a highly unusual father-son rap battle, with different generations and the one family lining up on opposing sides. Outside the concert, one of Cuba's most famous anti-censorship activists, Guillermo Farinas, laid out his fears to me.
Entonces, aquí estamos hablando de que hay que exigirle al gobierno cubano, sobre todo que haga cambios en la esfera política, porque si no vamos a ir a una mezcla entre lo que ocurrió en China, lo que ocurrió en Rusia, o lo que ocurrió en Egipto, y esa es la mezcla que ellos van a hacer. O sea, los mismos que están en el poder ahora van a seguir en el poder después, pero con dinero en el bolsillo porque los propios capitalistas se lo van a proporcionar. Eso es lo que tenemos que evitar.
To press their case in front of international media, the dissidents are also holding a conference on the sidelines of the President's summit. Not long ago, these people would never have been allowed to leave Cuba to attend a conference like this. So the fact they're here at all means that some things are changing for the better. Even so, most of these people continue to experience harassment and worse for speaking their mind.
Y espero que haber venido hasta aquí y haber puesto eso en riesgo valga de algo. Eso es lo que tenía que decir. Tengo un hijo de 5 años y por supuesto que estoy arriesgando mucho. Mis padres tienen miedo, mi familia también, de algo que pueda pasarme. Y eso es lo único que me preocupa.
David OMNI is another performer blacklisted by his government. Like Guillermo Farinas, he's not optimistic about the future.
For military people have all the power in Cuba and business and big houses, and it's good, but the people don't have nothing.
Back in Cuba, my government-approved local fixer, a former diplomat, reluctantly agrees to take me to catch up with David OMNI. It's a Saturday afternoon, and David's holding an artist's salon in his front yard.
Cuba, cubita, cubeta, culeca, pon el huevo ya, vieja.
The criticisms are not specific. Names like Castro are never spoken, but the meanings are all too clear. And when David finally takes the stage himself, the atmosphere is electric.
En nombre de la libertad comienzan las prisiones, inventan enemigos, elevan los controles, todo termina igual, miseria, adversidad, censura, impunidad, pobreza espiritual. Why you never stop, you never stop, you never stop, my friend.
With Cuba opening up, the authorities are now at a crossroads in how they deal with critics like David. And it's hard to know which way they'll jump. Long jail sentences for dissidents are getting rarer, but according to human rights groups, the number of short-term detentions nearly tripled last year.
All these small groups trying to open up some space are constantly harassed, repressed. Sometimes they allow them some expression. And then, without notice,
hay un amigo mío ahora mismo que está preso, se llama El Sexto. Él está preso porque él hizo un arte que al gobierno aquí no le gustó.
Opinions like David's are so outside the Cuban mainstream that my local fixer tells me he can't associate with these people any further and leaves. With no translator, David and I make the best of it.
Was that fun?
Yeah, I feel good, mate. All my friends is here today.
It's really hard to believe that a backyard salon like this could be a threat to the government. But for now, these are the contested limits of free speech in Cuba. One thing is clear about the changes though, it's making friendly neighbours out of Cold War enemies. On a Sunday afternoon, the sounds of a choir warming up echo from this 17th century church. Inside, it turns out to be young Americans from LA.
Feel the vibration in your skull.
They're preparing to sing alongside a Cuban ensemble. Collaborations like this used to be rare, but with the new thaw, they're coming thick and fast.
Mira, indiscutiblemente que esto para los dos pueblos significa algo. Significa algo importante desde el punto de vista espiritual, porque el pueblo americano es un pueblo que ha abogado por la relación con Cuba.
It seems people are keen to let bygones be bygones. One of the visiting choir boys was struck by a shopkeeper's reply when he asked if Americans had a bad reputation.
Her response was really sweet. She said, no, it's just the embargo is killing us. So, you know, Americans are fine, but their laws are really hurting us. And it was kind of bittersweet because it was nice to hear that we could be distinguished from our laws in some ways, but also kind of sad that, you know, we are responsible.
In the Plaza of the Revolution, more and more tourists are turning up to take happy snaps under the watchful gaze of Cuba's national heroes. It makes me wonder how Cuban culture will withstand the tidal wave of Americans and their media that's headed their way.
I am not worried because we have an open mind, we open all our doors, and our culture is very strong. And I don't believe in, you know, North American colonization of our way to being Cubans.
The Cuban government is aiming for a slow and steady thaw with the United States. But whatever changes are about to hit from across the Florida Straits, ordinary Cubans are eager to try playing a new tune.
Coño, yo creo que eso debería haber hecho hace años. De todas formas, al final nacimos y vamos a morir un día. Esa ambición por el mundo no sirvió. Es mejor la paz que la guerra.